I'm Asher Miller.
I'm Rob Dietz.
And I'm Jason Bradford. Welcome to Crazy Town, where three middle-aged white guys mansplain racism.
This is producer Melody Travers. In this season of Crazy Town, Jason, Asher, and Rob are exploring the watershed moments in history that have led humanity into the cascading crises we face in the 21st century. Today's episode is about the surreal invention of racism, its use in justifying slavery, and the socioeconomic shitshow that followed. The watershed moment took place in the year 1453. At the time, the estimated carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was 281 parts per million, and the global human population was 371 million.
Rob, Jason, I got a question for you. If you could give yourself a title, okay, and it didn't have anything to do with anything you've actually accomplished or anything real about you, what titles would you pick for yourselves?
This is sort of like Wicked Witch of the West or something like that. Like we have a...
Do you want to be the Wicked Witch of the West?
No, but unfortunately my mind went to things I've heard other people call me. I'd be like...
They've called you that?
But I'd be like Colonel Dipshit, sarcastic bastard from the South or something like that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a long title.
Yeah,
that's a good one. Apropos. But anyhow...
So you're going to call me Colonel Dipshit for the rest of this show.
I'll think about it. Well, I have a question. Share some clarification.
It's a secret ingredient.
Yeah. Can I be called a laird, the Scottish term for lord?
Oh, laird.
Yeah, is that okay?
Is that similar to lord?
Yeah, it's lord, but it's Scottish. And
got it.
I'm doing this because my wife was really into this Outlander books and stuff like that. And then there's that show, the TV show that came out.
Yeah.
And she kind of got a little bit into that.
I was thinking a better one for you is Tared. Kind of like for turd.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. But I would be, oh my gosh, I used to walk around calling her Aye Sassenach. And she liked that. Anyhow, I get a little personal.
Okay, so Tared, Lord Tared and Colonel Dipshit at your service, I guess.
I'd be Laird MacDongle.
MacDongle. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well,
I guess we gotta. Why do you ask?
You didn't ask me what I would be called.
Yeah. What would you be called?
Lord Douchebag, of course.
Well, that's been done.
Lord and Lady Douchebag. Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
Okay, the real reason I bring it up is because I wanted to introduce somebody to you guys. Okay.
Sweet.
Henry the Navigator. And as far as I know, Henry the Navigator never actually set sail in the Atlantic. I think the guy's been on a boat, but calling him a navigator might be a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, as I understand it, he was basically a financier. Never went on a voyage, just paid for them.
Well, we'll get to his story. I'm probably being a little unfair, to diss him for that name, since he was given the name like centuries after the guy died.
Okay.
Oh, he didn't promote himself as the navigator.
But then again, I don't feel so bad because the guy was an evil bastard. So fuck him. Really.
Okay.
But here's why he's important. I want to talk about him before we get to our watershed moment today. So Prince Henry the Navigator. Okay, let's go back in time.
Prince.
Yep, he was the third son, I think, of a king, and then he became the uncle of a king. He's arguably the most influential figure behind a lot, but behind Portugal's sort of short-lived global empire. Now,
whoa, wait a second. If it's arguable, let's talk about Cristiano Ronaldo for a second.
Yeah, so
here.
that's a second empire. I'm talking about the first empire.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Now, maybe some people are still learning about this in school, but at one point, this tiny little country, Portugal, was the dominant force on the seas. Mm-hmm. And Henry had a huge role to play behind that. He made a huge amount of money. Like, one of the things he did was he had like a monopoly on the manufacturing of soap.
That's a big deal.
That's a big deal. Yeah. I don't know what kind of soap it was.
Back to basics. I love it.
And, what he did was he actually used a lot of the wealth that he accumulated to finance both the invention of new sailing technologies, new sails, new types of ships, which are really key in actually being able to cross the Atlantic or go further down the Atlantic And
So he in his day was like these billionaires today that are launching rockets to space.
yeah, he's like the Elon Musk.
He was
of the
launching
15th
really nice
century.
boats.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't really go on him much, but he invented a bunch of stuff related to him.
Right, and he
That's
also, he was, I think, the originator of the first sugar plantations, which had a really profound role in the history of certainly the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, Halloween.
Yeah, exactly right. And the formations of the first colonies in the North Atlantic and in the western coast of Africa. But the reason I actually want to bring him up was because of his role in the creation of the African slave trade.
Oh, that's a downer.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was saying. Like, fuck the guy, if I insult him a little bit. But here's the thing. It's not actually Henry so much I want to talk about. I mean, Henry had a huge role to play, obviously. But it's this guy. His name is Gomez Yanis de Zurara. Okay, I'm mispronouncing his name. I'm trying to give a Spanish pronunciation, but I wouldn't even know how to give him a Portuguese pronunciation. Ever heard of this guy?
No.
Rings a bell, but there's so many loose fragments of 80s movies floating around up here.
Yeah.
Right.
It's on you to bring it up.
He's not he's not a 1980s villain. He's not any of that stuff. Okay. So
he didn't fight Rocky one time.
No, and he wasn't in WWE or WWF or any of that stuff either. No, back in 1452, okay, the king of Portugal charged Zurara, who's like the chronicler of the the kingdom or whatever, to document the life of his uncle, right, the king's uncle, Prince Henry. And it was in that book, The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. I mean, you could get it at any bookstore, I think, these days, right? It's just flying off the shelf.
Right.
And now, Guinea, I should just say, Guinea was the term the Portuguese came up with to describe lands in Africa that were south of the Senegal River.
Oh, it's a huge area then.
Yeah. And it was in that book that the historian Ibram Kendi argues that racism was first invented.
So it's invented in a biography of this guy, Henry.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I realize where this is ringing a bell from. So a few years ago, I know you listened to it as well as Cher. Jason, maybe you did too. We listened to the Seeing White series from a podcast called Seen on Radio.
Yeah, great series.
And basically the host, John Bewin, he relied a lot on Ibram Kendi's work and kind of explored racism, how the institution developed in the United States, and the sort of power dynamics involved there. And so, yeah, it's kind of I don't know, it was definitely a new thing to me, and I highly recommend that podcast.
Yeah. And so, Kendi and others have argued that it was Zurara's depiction of Africans as sort of innately inferior to Europeans that was used as a justification, and I think this is the key thing, after the fact, for what was really motivated by greed. Like, it was a justification for why these Africans were enslaved.
So the Portuguese were already over there kidnapping people, tearing up families, doing their evil shit.
Yeah,
and then they came up with, hey, there's a reason why this is okay.
Yeah, and it was, this was, again, very early days that this was happening, that this biography was written. But that's the thing I think I wanted to sort of explore today in this watershed moment.
What about the Pope? Wasn't the Pope involved in some of this stuff too?
Oh yeah, the Pope definitely has a role to play in this. And we're going to actually be talking about the Pope later. You're going to have to wait for that. Okay,
well I'm really comfortable talking about race and stuff. This is a really easy, relaxing subject for me. Jeez. Okay. But what's fascinating to me is this after the fact justification thing that is happening at the society level, right? It's the same thing that happens in the human mind. The mind will narrate an explanation for what has been done, and it'll just make stuff up.
Right, to try to make sense of something.
To make sense of something. So our subconscious is generating all sorts of motivations for us that lead to behavior, and we're kind of unaware of them a lot of the time. But then our so-called rational mind essentially rationalizes, like, oh, we did this because, all to make us feel better about ourselves.
Jason, you had a conversation with me a few years ago that this is bringing up in my mind. You were talking about helping people transition from conventional farming to organic. And you had said, it's not that you explain that organic is better for reason X, Y, and Z, and then somebody's going to change their mind and do it. It was more like, oh no, let's start farming organically. Here's the field, and they start doing it, and then they come up with all the reasons themselves to justify it. It's like behavior change, then the thinking changes.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and I think it's a really interesting parallel to make. I am not going to give Zurara and these guys as much credit for the motivation behind this justification, because it was and this is what we're going to talk about, it was an ongoing belief system that was built in a justification for exploitation and the most inhumane treatment of others that's probably imaginable, right?
Yeah. I mean, in fact, let's not give them any credit. And to demonstrate that, we've got some pull quotes from that book that you mentioned that's just flying off the shelves.
Sure,
right?
Let's hear them.
So obviously these are translated from the original language, but this one just reminded me of you, Jason. Here's Zurara talking about how awesome Prince Henry, what is it, Henry the asshole? Henry the Navigator, right?
Yeah, same thing.
This noble prince was of good height and stout frame, big and strong of limb. Strength of heart and keenness of mind were in him to a very excellent degree. The flowery nature of these. It goes on, and beyond comparison, he was ambitious of achieving great and lofty deeds. So maybe the nickname you got for yourself, could it fit a description like that?
Yeah, Laird MacDongle.
Right.
You know, when they buried Zurara, they couldn't get that brown stain off of his nose. You know?
What's amazing is how much harder it was to write back then, but how he was just going on with a bunch of bullshit anyway.
Right. I like that. The lofty deeds of Lord MacDongle. That sounds like a really good...
that book is going to fly off the shelf, too.
So, and of course, these flowery, over-the-top descriptions of Henry are juxtaposed with his just horrendous descriptions of the folks from Africa. And I'm not even going to read them because fuck that guy.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. Well, I think it'd be interesting to talk about this, bring it to the U.S. and put what happened here in some kind of historical context. Because in the U.S., slavery and racism are closely linked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But slavery didn't start in the 1400s, right? It has existed across the globe for as long as we can go back in history and check on things.
Again, it began a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away when the Jabba the Hutt chained up Princess Leia.
I mean, evidence right there. It's like universal. So there's evidence of slavery across Europe, across Asia, across Africa, the Americas. As far back as anyone can look, this stuff was happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even that word slavery, if you look at the root of it, my Latin teacher would be proud of me here, it comes from Slav, which is the name that the Western Europeans gave to the Eastern European people.
Right, and they had been sold into slavery.
Right.
Following repeated conquests.
Right.
Yeah, that's my point. Historically, slavery was typically the result of some sort of conquest, and you'd capture people, and even though there may have been religious differences between people that were fighting each other, racism wasn't used as a justification for enslaving people until our friend
Zurara.
Yeah. Well, we know from basically every episode of Crazy Town that there's always nuance. There's always complexities here. It's not cut and dry that Zurara is the inventor of racism. Some academics, there's this guy Benjamin Isaac, who's got a book called The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, who has presents some evidence that racism existed in Europe going back to ancient Greece. It's hard to pinpoint, but Zurara is a really good example of someone who popularized racism in Portugal and exported that to other countries.
Yeah, I'm sure that the history is a lot more nuanced and messy and complex. And I think that trying to pinpoint this source, the origin story of racism, is actually not really, I think, the point here. The point is, for why I think Zurara's writings in 1452 are such a watershed moment, is that they reflect what became, and maybe even inspire what became, the merger of these sort of two dominant systems, right, that really shaped the world and were part of what brings us to Crazy Town where we are now, these two dominant systems of racism and the exploitation of people.
Yeah, so using it as a justification, bringing the two together.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now before we talk more broadly about how racism has led us into Crazy Town, let's just put sort of this African slave trade into context a little bit. So, first of all, there were about 12.5 million men, women, and children of African descent that were forced into the transatlantic slave trade. 12.5 million people on these little boats at the time, right? Coming across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
Just rounded up in their homeland and put on boats and sailed away. It's just astonishing. That's a lot.
Well, and this topic is really hard. I have this visceral moment of remembering from childhood seeing that illustration of how to pack a slave boat. And, to say put on a boat is such an understatement. I mean, the conditions, the breakup of families, I don't know. I mean, obviously our shtick here is we make light of things and we joke a lot with each other, but some of these topics, it's just so depraved, and you can't believe that we're capable of doing this to each other. So yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, the just looking back at the history of it, maybe throw a few more stats around on it. That slave trade grew pretty slowly before 1600, but like everything, you have this sort of the economic incentives really pushed them. So you had sugar spreading around, you had tobacco plantations, later you would have cotton, but thanks to the profits you could earn from these commodities, that they're like, hey, we need more labor. Hey, we can exploit the shit out of these people, and hey, we can justify it with these ridiculous racist ideas.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating also to think about is Congress eventually banned the importation of slaves in 1808. However, the slave population in the U.S. just kept growing from a little over 1 million in 1810, according to census data, to nearly 4 million in 1860. And that represented over 10% of the entire U.S. population.
Yeah.
But of course, the slave-owning states definitely had the majority of that. So there were some places that were really dominated by slave populations. And there are some stunning maps published by Smithsonian Magazine that go over this, and we'll link to those in our show notes.
Yeah, there's these visuals showing kind of population density, and changes over time, and including the spread west, as the U.S. grew.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about the Atlantic slave trade sort of ending, but then there was a within continent slave trade that was thriving. I mean, of course, you had people being born and the population increasing, but you also had people moving slaves all around up and down the eastern seaboard, and as you said, Cher, moving them out west.
Yeah. There was a fascinating studies on the economics of this, where the southern states are actually not very profitable from an agricultural perspective, and they were really depleting the soils. And so the yields were poor, and synthetic fertilizers and hadn't really been invented, of course, at this point. So there was marginal to negative income on a lot of their crops, and so they were all excited about their ability to sell slaves, and that was a huge part of politics in the U.S.
Yeah, and I just will mention briefly, we're spending a lot of our time talking about the U.S. More Africans were stolen from Africa as part of the slave trade and sent to Brazil, even than the United States.
Yeah.
So it wasn't obviously isolated to the U.S.
Yeah, and the Caribbean islands as well.
I think obviously we could spend a lot of time talking about this and probably not doing it anywhere near justice. But I think, again, just trying to put this a little bit into context, I think it's important to remember that even after slavery ended in the U.S., the impact of slavery, and obviously more broadly the impact of systemic racism against Black Americans, that legacy is alive with us to this day, sadly, you only have to look at the disparities in health and education, wealth, incarceration rates, disenfranchisement, exposure to pollution, on and on and on and on, to see how much it remains still very much embedded in the American experience.
Yeah, there's a historian, David Roediger. He has this quote that sums up, I think, what you're talking about really nicely. He says, quote, "The world got along without race for the overwhelming majority of its history. The U.S. has never been without it." When I read that quote, I also found this graphic that shows, basically breaks down how long the U.S. has had slavery, then how long it was in the Jim Crow era with segregation, and then the post-segregation civil rights to now. And the current era is a pretty small piece of our history. Yeah. And that's why we are in this, this time that we are now, where you have systemic racism still running rampant.
Yeah, like land ownership, for example, and all of the giving away land. The U.S. government did that for settlers, but it was very hard if you were an African American to get that free land and establish as a farmer, for example, and create that family wealth. And
more recently, the GI Bill, and there are organizations that do a really great job at documenting some of these disparities, and that are worth looking at, and we can reference those.
I grew up on the West Coast of America, and for me, what's interesting is there's a whole history there that is not just limited to the African-American experience of racism, but we had a whole set of immigrants coming across the Pacific, and we had a lot of issues in how we dealt with those folks as well.
Yeah, there's some good stats on this too. Like between the 19th and 20th centuries, there were over 600 separate pieces of anti-Asian legislation that got passed that were limiting citizenship opportunities for Asians. They had almost no rights, and white people could kill Asians basically with impunity because they couldn't testify in court.
Oh,
it's it's unbelievable. You start digging into this history. Yeah. Oof. Well, I think thinking about racism in the larger context, right? I mean, we've spoken a lot about the history of the slave trade and the impact of that, in the United States. I think it's interesting to think a little bit about whiteness. So, Rob, you referenced that podcast series.
Yeah, Seeing White.
Seeing White, that we'd recommend to people. Thinking about what it means to be white, and how there have been changing definitions of what it means to be white over time in the United States. The professor, a writer and a scholar named Dorothy Roberts, has written a lot about this in a book called Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. But part of what she talks about in that book is not just what's happening now, but looking at the history of changes in how we define race over time. She points out that since the very first U.S. Census was taken in 1790, the racial groupings in the census have changed 24 times over about 200 years.
So we have a shift here then from the heinousness of racism to the ridiculousness of racism, and the mental gymnastics that people will perform in order to hang on to their privilege or their power. So give me some examples of this. Who is white in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about it, like people that are now considered white, like for me for example, right? I'm Jewish, half American, half Dutch Jew, basically, right? But
can I interrupt you first? I have a funnier story. A few years ago, a child that I know was talking about you because I was working with you, and this child said, are you going to see that Indian guy? Because it was summer, I guess.
I had a tan.
And you had a tan. And
I'm so jealous.
I tan nicely.
It's incredible.
I just thought
your hair, just...
It was one of those examples of like the meaninglessness of skin color,
right. My Semitic roots coming out. But what I was saying is, like, now if I fill out the census, I got essentially one option, right? Like white, non-Hispanic.
Yeah.
That wasn't always the case for Jews in the United States, being considered part of white America. And it's the same thing is true. You look at Irish, Italians.
So there's not a thing in the census that says space laser wielding Jew as one of the races?
I mean, if Marjorie Taylor Greene becomes, president someday, that may change.
All right.
Let's see what happens. Right.
I don't think she's in line. I think she's going to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is her next political move.
But yeah, so think about that. Like you, Jason, you must be so conflicted inside. I mean, your lineage, you go right back to the Mayflower, so as white can be.
Yeah.
But you also, you have Italian in your family and maybe some Irish, right?
I do, yeah. So, we call those bog trotters, the Irish side, and spaghetti slurpers on the Italian side. And they got together and they made me, so.
Yeah, and
can we just reference where that's from? For a second.
Yeah, that's the what is it called? The racial slur database. A real thing that we found on the
.org
on the internet.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Yeah, those are some of the nicer ones.
Yeah. I don't know who's behind that project. That's a little odd.
Yeah. Well, so how did that happen? How did all these folks? The Italians, the Irish, the Slavs, and the Jews, they became white. Well, in some respect, America was called this sort of melting pot, and you would adopt American culture. So I think there was a tremendous pressure for these folks as they come on as immigrants, right? And they don't speak English necessarily, but then their kids' generation starts adopting whatever the American culture is of the time. And because they kind of look white, they get granted this sort of entry into whiteness, I think, is what's going on. Yeah,
there's a pressure, a desire, a benefit of assimilation, right, into kind of like a quote-unquote white culture and sort of passing as white. I mean, not to say that this was like part of my experience, but I was an immigrant kid. I moved to the United States when I was, 6 years old and coming from Israel. I had what people thought was a funny name and I had a funny accent, and I just wanted to assimilate so badly. I refused to speak Hebrew anymore at home.
Yeah.
I changed my name to Steve.
Did you?
Yeah. For a couple months or something.
This is a reveal.
Yeah. Because I wanted so much to fit into U.S. culture. The reason I changed my name to Steve is because it was Steve Austin, the $6 million man. I got to see him on TV.
I was going to say, not Steven, but Steve.
Yeah,
exactly. Good.
Yeah. You could, just a small example.
That was cool.
Maybe
when he changed his name, he could suddenly see like a mile
and
down the road.
That sound.
He could jump over buildings.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I love that show.
Plus, he got to go on dates with the Bionic Woman.
Oh, she. Oh.
Yeah. I don't know why I ever changed my name back. I've got deep regret.
Were you down at the courthouse with a legal process as a 6-year-old?
Actually, what ended up
happening... Steve.
You can imagine my family for a while were like scratching their heads. They try to laugh it off a little bit. And then eventually you give them credit. They're like, okay, this is what he wants to do. They actually started calling me Steve. And at that point I was like, no.
It was too weird to hear your mom and dad say Steve, exactly. So you were back to a share.
I want to point out this, if we think about, we talked a little bit about racism more broadly in the United States, right? Not being limited to the African-American Black experience, but also dynamic more broadly. I think we also have to point out the obvious, which racism is ubiquitous across the world, right? I mean, it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. It has a particular role within American society that is deep and profound, right?
Yeah.
That's unique. But it's not like it doesn't exist in other places, and it manifests itself in really ugly ways in many, 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 many places.
Yeah, many have pointed out that first you have these religious reasons, right? Where the Pope declares this is okay or whatever. But then, of course, as society changes and you get sort of the Enlightenment period, suddenly science or the so-called tools of science start getting used as justification for racism.
They needed a new justification, right? You couldn't say this was God's will that this group of people were subservient or could be enslaved or could be treated like crap, right? You had to have another justification.
Right. So as you get into the 1800s, that starts to become more and more important in the early 20th century.
Yeah, well, Jason, you're a man of science,
Thank
right?
You.
I mean,
thank you.
We know you are Dr. Jason Bradford, PhD.
That's not his real title, remember?
Piled higher and deeper.
Right.
He's Laird.
Laird Laird McDongle,
Dr.
PhD.
Laird.
Dr. Laird McDongle.
Well, and we know also, I've hung out with you enough that I know you're a plant biologist.
Thank you.
Running around tropics, looking at, what was it, the Cuneaceae family?
The Cunoniaceae.
Cunoniaceae.
Yeah, he's always name dropping these Latin names for.
Well, you got one named after you, right? Like the Cunoniaceae bradfordii.
No, Gysois bradfordii, endemic to New Caledonia or Nouvelle Caledonie.
You're making
a colonist.
You're making the argument even better. You know all this stuff. Well,
Yes.
so you know this whole scientific classification. That's the Linnaean system, right? Named
Yes.
after Carl or Carolus Linnaeus.
Yes. I know all about that. Yes, I use it.
Yeah, we did a little looking, and
Linnaeus, by the way, he described the genus that I first got into this with, Weinmannia, was described by Linnaeus. So
Okay.
I have a direct kind of
Your
you're
relation.
making
origin
this worse.
story. You're gonna feel
I have
sad
like an
about
origin
in a
story.
second,
So
buddy.
like Linnaeus and I were kind of tight, right?
Yeah, great. Well, so as soon as you start, looking under the first layer on some of these guys from that era, you find some pretty shitty stuff. So,
What are you talking about?
So Linnaeus didn't just classify tropical plants and beetles and mammals. Well, he also, of course, divided the human species into 4 quote unquote natural varieties. Okay. So, of course, the pinnacle of beauty and intelligence was Homo sapiens europaeus. And, these are the vigorous, muscular, sounds like frickin' Zurara all over again.
Yeah.
You could just see him like looking at himself in the mirror, trying to
Right.
come up with like these, build himself up.
Yeah, he's like flexing his pecs and coming up with even better adjectives. Bulging chest. Or something. So number 2 in his hierarchy here was Homo sapiens americanus, who were ill-tempered and impassive.
Those must be
people.
indigenous, right?
Yeah,
Indigenous.
people in the Americas. Then he gets to Homo sapiens asiaticus, who are melancholy and stern. And then, of course, at the bottom, he gets to Homo sapiens afer. And I'm not even going to read his bullshit. These
Don't
people.
you wish we could have a time machine so you can go back and punch these guys in the face? I mean, seriously.
I wish you could stay on this side, but there was the portal, and your fist would go through, hit him in the face while he's flexing his pecs in the mirror.
Yeah, the portal is the mirror.
Right?
This comes right through. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Which version of humans is the fairest of all? Pow.
You sort of think like these. I'm sure Linnaeus was a really intelligent person, but at the same time, such an idiot too.
And this is a crazy thing, right? It's like you have sort of a lot of this sort of pseudoscience happening where, again, it ties back to justifying whatever power dominance hierarchy you're in right now.
And that is why we wanted to talk about this watershed moment. That Zurara writing this chronicle of Henry the Navigator and creating a racial justification, because what it is, race and all these forms of differentiation that we see is used as a tool for economic exploitation, in maintaining power over those who don't have it. It's about maintaining power for an elite, whoever that elite is.
Yeah, that's the thread you always follow when you're looking at racism. What are the power dynamics and who's exploiting who?
Yeah, and it's interesting because even in the U.S. history, we had all these indentured servants that would come over. Very poor Europeans.
Right,
would
like
come,
in the colonial
Yes.
era before the United States was
yes,
formed, right?
They would basically get sponsored, paid to get over. Their trip would be paid for. Then they'd land somewhere, and next thing you know, they're indebted to somebody, and they'd be working for them for a certain period of time. And that is different from the chattel slavery of Africans in early U.S. history. But of course, these become wedge populations. Like these two folks, the indentured servants and the chattel slaves have a lot in common, right? They're being absurdly exploited.
And there are actually historical examples of them organizing together and writing and trying to create, in a sense, their own societies. And they were completely cracked down upon. Yeah, so I think you're right. I think we see often that these are used as wedges. It was used as a wedge all the way back.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, and that's you still see that today,
You're talking about pitting them against each other,
Right.
though,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yes.
somehow you have these indentured servants that are supposed to be made to feel superior to the slaves, and so you put them against each other rather than where they should be united against the system just repeating itself and trying to maintain power.
And that dynamic has persisted throughout. You know, I think it's probably true in many cultures and societies in many ways, but in the United States, that dynamic has played out repeatedly. And if you sort of fast forward and you look at the struggle, the civil rights struggle, you know, for women to get the right to vote, and for African Americans to also receive rights to vote and other things after the Civil War, there were efforts by some, basically black women, to tie those together, to come together to fight for those rights in tandem. And there are stories of how white suffragettes tried to shut that down. There's an amazing speech given by Sojourner Truth where she says, "Ain't I a woman?" talking about this.
Yeah, that really hits home. I think you saw this in all of these rights movements. I mean, when MLK was leading civil rights, he had this kind of evolution of his discussion and his speeches where there's the famous one where he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He kind of broadened out from civil rights for African Americans to poverty and an anti-war stance, and sort of realizing it's inequality, it's this exploitation that we need to do away with for everybody.
Yeah, and this really ties back to a framework that we've talked about before, which is the notion of cultural materialism that Marvin Harris sort of described, in which infrastructure, so how the economic system, the power structures, these sort of things, drives society laws, and they call the structure, and also the superstructure, or sort of norms and belief systems. And this is, I think, really applicable in this case, where the exploitation of people and, of course, our exploitation of nature is supporting particular structures of power and the whole sort of system itself. But what we then do, even if a lot of people are suffering as a consequence, and nature itself is also being exploited horrifically to our long-term detriment, we find ways of justifying what is. And a belief system like racial superiority is just one of those.
Yeah, I feel like I saw that a fair amount growing up. Like you'd hear some racist expounding on their racist views, but trying to base it in what they see in society around them, with no realization that that's built on this horrendous history of oppression.
Right.
You know, it's just like, I'm just going to blame it on the fact that you have more melanin in your skin.
Right.
But I think it really is tied to what you're talking about. This is the infrastructure that we have now. So my beliefs, I don't want to even say whoever was saying it, their beliefs are now tied to this bogus explanation.
Yeah, so correlation without understanding causation.
Yeah. I've had this weird thought recently, just trying to figure out, why do we do this? Why do we take someone who looks different and make them out to be something different? And I just been wondering, are there some innate things about us? And the thing that I got that, I don't know, maybe this means something, maybe it doesn't, but we're such visual creatures. It's very easy to look and say, oh, you have darker skin than I do, or you have lighter skin than I do. And I wonder if we have a penchant for categorizing things based on visual cues. We also have a penchant for scapegoating that we've talked about a lot in this podcast. Maybe combining those two things sort of makes it easy when you add to that the cultural materialism piece for people to end up in this camp.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of plenty of 80s movies where there's the different high school groups, and they all have their different looks about them, right? And they're trying to create this in-group sense and out-grouping others that don't have the same fancy '80s hair or whatever, or aren't wearing the same goth clothing or whatever it is.
And
right?
then they all come together at detention.
Yes.
In the Breakfast Club.
Yes.
And
First of
they
all,
all get along.
if we're gonna talk about racism and John Hughes, that's a whole nother episode that we could fill up like that. So
That's true. I mean, yeah, it's not just. We talked about this in our last season, and when we talked about hidden drivers, we talked about cognitive biases and these things that are kind of like traits that have developed over our evolutionary history, which are not, by the way, we're not saying are justifications for racism.
Right.
But we're pointing out that it's something that I think we have to be particularly sensitive to recognize that there might be a tendency. And I'm particularly concerned, as we're saying before, race is not the only conceptualized source of differentiation that we have. It's one that's deeply embedded in our history. It's still very deeply embedded in our society. I think we're seeing maybe some positive signs of at least awareness of that and more of a collective conversation about it being systemic. But I'm particularly concerned for all the things that we talk about here on Crazy Town, all the issues that we face, the fact that we're hurtling towards these environmental limits, that we're going to be dealing with a lot more unraveling of kind of social cohesion and stability and norms that in times of great stress and uncertainty, you combine that with this tendency for in-group, out-group things and maybe historical patterns of differentiation or just an innate way of saying, well, that person looks different than me or behaves differently than me. It's a recipe for really bad shit to happen, and I think we have to be really, really vigilant about it.
Yeah, we have to focus on what binds us rather than what separates us.
And the most important thing is don't name your kid Zurara.
Yeah.
Henry, I think you can get away with.
Yeah, or Laird McDongle is fine.
And no Linnaeus, okay? No more Linnaeus.
No more.
Colonel Dipshit is off the table too. Hey, you guys, we got another good review, this time on the Podchaser app from someone named Cataclysm.
Oh.
Perfect username for this show, huh?
Yep.
So Cataclysm says, Crazy Town gives you a podcast where they actually keep thinking about serious issues like energy consumption and overpopulation for an extended period of time without getting distracted by the latest blunders in politics or popular culture. And, unbelievably, it's entertaining to listen to. It is kind of unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
I appreciate that insight because you're right. We try to stay highbrow. Bird's eye.
Have you listened to our podcast?
Cataclysm, thank you. You're right on. You're spot on with that.
Anyway, please follow the Cataclysm if you can and write us a review. Thanks.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
Okay, it's pretty clear we're not going to have the recipe for ending racism, but there are a lot of things that we can all try to do to help this situation. And the very first one, I think, is do some self-work, right? Try to understand and study the history, sort of like what we've been doing in preparation for discussing this. And if you're like us, if you happen to be like in the United States, white and privileged, try to figure out what that means, where you can step back and shut up and let others lead the way and basically not exploit that privilege and continue that. I really had a tough moment. I moved to Oregon and was utterly unaware of its sordid racist history. I mean, anywhere you go in the United States, you could probably find a good sordid racist story. But Oregon was particularly bad with sunset laws, basically expelling people of color from its municipalities. And you see the effects today, just the demographics. I think Portland's the whitest big city in the country. These things linger on. So I think having a good sense of that history and really recognizing the power dynamics that have flowed from that is a really good starting point.
In the case of Oregon, it's not just history. We still have a lot of white supremacist groups around. It's definitely part of the dynamic.
Yeah, for sure.
I had this really interesting experience when my great-grandfather was getting on in age. You know, it was a typical thing where the families spread out and they're all in their careers. And so what you do, if you've got enough money, and he had saved enough, is you hire helpers, right? And this woman started coming into the house to clean up, cook for him, make sure he got his meds, etc. And then they developed a real relationship where as he got more and more needy, she became kind of his full-time helper. And eventually he bought a house that she and her husband and 2 kids lived in with him. And when he passed, that was their house. He basically bought it for them. And he just became part of their family. Now, what's fascinating to me is they were an immigrant family from Latin America. And I remember him talking to me, maybe one of the last conversations I had with him, and he's very reflective of the time. And he was basically saying, you know, I spent most of my life as a racist. I really look down on people like this. And he was in tears, and he was acknowledging that, and how sad he was that he didn't recognize how wonderful these folks, or any human, can be, and how loving, and how he saw how they lived together, and how they treated each other, and how they cared for him. And I was just like floored. Yeah. So I think there is opportunities for anybody to change like that.
That's a really sweet story, Jason, because I thought you were going to go kind of like to this place that you see the rest of the family was really upset because they didn't get the money and he gave it to the caregiver. But it's not that at all. So I'm like, that's a really good example.
We thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example of what we're talking about, like reckoning with your own stuff and your own views and trying to get to the bottom of it.
And giving up some privilege.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think there's a lot of individual sort of internal work and behavioral work that all of us who are in a situation where we benefited from white privilege to recognize our own prejudices, think about our own behaviors and our contribution, how we continue to contribute to a system.
Yeah. Even through silence.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. And not everyone is in a position to do things to try to rebalance in a sense. But if you are, like your grandfather, I mean, that was a major gesture, which obviously was not done from a racial lens or something, right? This was done because he had a relationship. And I think that's the whole point. I guess I would add in thinking about doing the opposite, and it's not so much a doing the opposite, but it's a going further, right? So I think what we're seeing right now, and I see it as a positive step for sure, is a movement to kind of address legacy stuff, right? Statues, the names on buildings, the names of roads, whatever it is.
I am glad you brought this up. I love this stuff. Seriously, we live in this matrix of names and monuments and stuff.
And you grew up in the South, so
So there's been 3 examples in very recent history that have kind of blown me away, and that I'm going to share with you guys. So one, a few years ago, I took this civil disobedience course, and the teacher of it, she had put all these cool historic photos, like MLK speaking at the Lincoln Memorial, and a bunch of other photos up on the wall. And at some point she said, go take one of these photos, pick your favorite, and then, explain why you like it. And I saw this one of this woman who it turns out her name is Bree Newsom. And she was on top of this flagpole in front of the South Carolina Capitol, tearing the Confederate flag down. I think this happened about 5 years ago. And I was like, what a badass.
Yeah.
She just went there, climbed it. She knew she was going to get arrested, and she was probably trying not to be harmed in the process, but really awesome, direct, like, I'm taking down this symbol of oppression, and I'm going to pay the price for it. That's one example. Another, When I lived in the D.C. area, there was a point where I was living in Virginia, just off of Lee Highway, which, of course, named after Robert E. Lee. And that's just been changed to Langston Boulevard, which is interesting in the Crazy Town perspective from this show about racism, where it goes from Robert E. Lee to John Langston, who was the first African-American from Virginia to be elected to Congress. But also from highway to boulevard, because they sort of wanted it to be more like a main street than have this super highway type name. So yeah, it's kind of a little two-piece bonus piece there. Okay, the third thing that's really got me amped up is I live most of the time in Portland now, and I'm pretty close to Mount Tabor, which is this. It used to be a big part of the water infrastructure of the city. Now it's a park, so it's got forested, extinct volcano, and
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a neat spot. You get out in the woods in the middle of the city, and right at the top of it, there was this monument to a guy named Harvey Scott, who was the chief editor or the head of the Oregonian newspaper way back in the day. And famously, he was against women's suffrage and kind of one of these
assholes.
Yeah, white guy douchebags. Yeah. He probably read Zurara's book or some shit, right? So, a lot of people didn't like that this is the monument that's sort of looming over the city. And at some point, it got torn down. And so then you just had this blank pedestal that was sitting there for a while. And finally, a sculptor actually put a new bust up on this pedestal, and it was of York. And York was a person who had been enslaved, and he was a member of the Lewis and Clark Party.
Right, oh, wow. I remember reading about York.
Yeah, so he was in it. He was an integral member. Like, he was really good at taking care of people who got sick. He was good at hunting, and just a full on wilderness explorer.
Yeah, world at his badass.
Yeah, going across
Total badass.
The continent.
Yeah.
And after the mission was successful, he asked Clark if he could have his freedom, and Clark refused.
Oh, God.
Because maybe he read Zurara too. I don't know. What the hell's wrong with people? But anyway, this bust of York went up there. And while I was looking into this, I found out another fact that just freaking blew my mind. So the original statue of Harvey Scott was sculpted by Gutzon Borglum, who it turns out is the guy that made the giant bas relief Confederate monument, biggest Confederate monument in the world at frickin' Stone Mountain.
Oh, right, yeah.
Where I grew up.
Yeah.
With Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and whoever the last, Lord McDonegal, Stonewall Jackson was up there.
Laird.
Yeah, sorry. It just, this guy, I can't stand it. Gutzon Borglum.
So he carved out a niche for himself for making statues of the most reprehensible people in the
I think
US.
he had this huge white supremacist agenda and carved it into the frickin' landscape.
I think we should name a venereal disease after that dude. I got Gutzon.
Yeah.
Gutzon Borglum.
Gutzonditis, Borglatitis of the testicles or so. Yeah. So it's an ongoing drama, actually, because then the York bust was torn down.
No.
So the city, I think, is trying to figure out what it wants to do. It's still, right now, it's an empty pedestal. And I say, take it all out. Let's just have it be nature and be done. But I wouldn't mind having the York statue back.
Yeah.
So, but my point was, all these things I think are really positive signs. I am supportive, but I would challenge us to go further. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I worry that these kinds of changes, changing the names of schools, changing the names of streets, taking down statues, it could be easy to sort of rest on your laurels and say, pat yourself on the back and say, we've made this correction,
Right.
But a true reckoning, and I think there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't kind of erase our history because we need to grapple with it. But beyond that, it's more about, let's get to the true legacy of these people. It's not the fact that they have a name on a building.
Right.
It's their direct impact and their collective impact of a system that continues to further exploit and generate completely unequal results for people. So we have to get to the true sources of this injustice.
Like the tax code.
I mean,
I mean, for God's sakes, if as much time was spent on the tax code as we spent on this stuff,
right.
maybe there'd be a difference by now.
So we need to get to the economic
Yes.
roots, the systemic roots of these things. And we need to play, I think you talked about this, Rob, where when we look at our own behavior, sometimes that behavior is complacency, it's silence. I think we need to take it upon ourselves to say that splintering of identities or somehow trying to, I don't know, say, this group has got a worse off than this group or whatever. We need to see that all of this differentiation and exploitation is about maintaining power for an elite group of people. So we need to come together in a sense to get to the source of all of that.
Yeah. And if all this fails, work on inventing that time machine so you can punch Zurar in the face.
Please, and if you do, let me know.
Yeah.
I'll be the first to sign up.
Yeah, he'll be a test pilot.
Absolutely.
We want to give a special thanks to Ilana Zuber, our star researcher of the watershed moments through history. Without her work, there's no way we could have covered such sweeping topics this season.
Yeah, and we also want to thank our other outstanding volunteers. Anya Steyer provides original artwork for us, and Taylor Antal prepares the transcripts for each episode.
And a big, big thank you to our producer, Melanie Travers, who helps us bozos stay professional.
And finally, thanks to you, our listeners. If you want to help others find their way to Crazy Town, please drop us a 5-star rating and hit that share button when you hear an episode you like.
Hey guys, amazing sponsor this week. This is something I've been looking for and some people have stepped up. I'm talking about the Metaverse Sustainability Coalition. And
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal. In the metaverse, we cannot afford to repeat the same mistakes we made in the universe. We need sustainable development and communities. We need walkable towns, local food, less consumerism waste, plus equity. This is a big one, guys. It is very concerning to all of us who are watching the development of the metaverse that is already full of shopping centers, high-priced NFT art, and luxury brands, and that a scarcity mentality and aggressive private property rights, the same old investment class, is excited about making a financial killing off this. We desperately need the fine work being done by the Metaverse Sustainability Coalition to fight for us and a better fake world, to protect the commons and make a more equitable metaverse for all to enjoy.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.